The smiling version of me reached out before I did. That was the part I still couldn't explain, even inside my own head. I knew I had moved. I remembered the lunge, the wet skid of my boots across the frost-slick floor of sub-level B, the pressure in the air as I'd run straight into the bottom of the sea. I remembered Lena shouting something behind me. My name, I thought, or maybe a warning. But the room was already full of other voices using it. Every version of me had started moving at once. One limped forward with blood drying under one ear. One kept backing away, shaking his head. One stood perfectly still, eyes closed, as if he had already accepted whatever was coming. But the smiling one, my God, the smiling one watched me with a kind of gentle pity, like I was the one arriving late to an appointment he had been patient enough to keep, and the walls pulsed around us. The ocean outside the thick observation glass had gone flat and black and absolute, a sheet of polished stone suspended beneath the platform. Then the internal phone rang somewhere above us, a sharp, ordinary office sound. A ridiculous sound, and the smiling version of me stepped forward. I stepped back, or maybe I didn't. Maybe that was the moment I stopped being the one who was afraid. 48 hours earlier. The first thing they gave me wasn't a key card. It was a folder. That detail mattered now in a way it hadn't then. At the time, I'd only registered it as another corporate eccentricity, another layer of procedure from a company that wanted a paper trail more than competence. Pelagos Atlantic had contracted me to spend 14 days on offshore platform Delta in a decommissioned marine research station they had partially reopened for systems continuity maintenance. That was the phrase on the contract. Systems continuity maintenance. It sounded harmless in the way legal language always did when it wanted to keep blood off the floor. The helicopter dropped me onto the platform just before dusk. The sky was iron gray, the sea rough enough to look alive, and the whole structure rose out of it like something that had been forgotten on purpose. Delta wasn't one of the sleek new rigs with clean lines and bright modular housing. It had the wide, rust-shadowed bones of an older installation. Research first, industrial second. Weather sensors crowned the upper deck. Dead antenna arrays leaned off the communications tower at angles that looked almost anatomical. Every exposed surface sweated salt. Graham Keller met me at the landing pad. He was the site supervisor, at least on paper. Compact build, silver hair clipped close to the scalp, expression pleasant in the way accountants and undertakers often managed. Professional calm, withholding. He shook my hand once and said, "Mr. Mercer, travel all right?" I told him it had been fine. That wasn't true. The pilot hadn't spoken for the last 20 minutes of the flight, and twice I'd looked down at the water and had the unpleasant impression that the whitecaps were rotating beneath us in neat circular patterns, like eyes turning to follow the sound of the blades. But I needed the work, and need can make almost anything seem routine. Keller led me through a series of narrow corridors toward the administration. The platform smelled of damp insulation, machine oil, and something older underneath. Brine trapped in walls that had been sealed too many times and never dried properly. Fluorescent strips buzzed overhead. Every fourth or fifth light flickered with a private rhythm. 3 active personnel on nights besides you, Keller said. Madsen handles operations. Shaw covers med support and systems. You'll be responsible for mechanical maintenance and emergency integrity checks. Just 4 people on a platform this size? It isn't operating at full capacity. He said it with such mild confidence that I almost didn't notice he hadn't really answered the question. The office he brought me to had once been a records room. Metal cabinets lined the walls. A dead clock hung above a notice board layered with years of curled safety postings. Keller set the folder in front of me, waited until I sat, and then opened it. Inside were 2 stapled documents. Both were labeled in block print, Night Protocol, Offshore Platform Delta. Both carried the Pelagos logo, both were typed on identical letterhead, and both were completely different. The first set read like an ordinary night shift procedure, stripped down to the kind of essential directives no one argued with until they had a reason. Rule 1. Always respond to internal calls within 30 seconds. Rule 2. If the ocean appears calm after midnight, initiate lockdown. Rule 3. Maintain visual confirmation of all personnel at shift start. Rule 4. Never access sub-level B during night operations. The second set looked almost the same. Same spacing, same signature line, same faint watermark visible when I tilted the page toward the window. But the wording had changed. Rule 1. Do not respond to internal calls after midnight. Rule 2. If the ocean is calm, it is already inside. Rule 3. Do not trust the initial personnel count. Rule 4. Sub-level B is the only safe place after 1 a.m. I read both sets twice, then a third time, sure I had missed a version date or formatting difference that would make the joke obvious. I found nothing. I looked up at Keller. Which one is correct? He smiled. Not broadly, not theatrically. Just a small, courteous upward movement at the corners of his mouth, as if I had asked where the spare batteries were kept. You'll figure it out, he said. I laughed because there are moments when people laugh not from amusement but from an inability to believe they've heard something sincere. He didn't laugh back. I'm serious, I said. So am I. He closed the folder. He pushed it toward me and rose from the chair. That should have been the point where I walked back to the helipad and demanded the next transport off. I know that. I knew it even then in the part of my mind that never truly stopped cataloging danger. But there were practical weights on the other side of the scale. Practical things keep people in bad places. My last contract had ended under the kind of internal review that doesn't quite ruin you on paper but stains everything after it. There had been a floodgate, a delayed seal check, a man named Tom Avery who died in a compartment that should never have filled that quickly. My report had been careful. My testimony had been cleaner than the truth. Pelagos had still hired me. That alone should have frightened me more than the folder did. Keller showed me to my berth, then to the galley, and then to the operations wing, where I met Hal Madsen and Priya Shah. Madsen looked built out of cable and bad sleep, long-faced, sandy beard, shoulders that stayed tense even standing still. Priya was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, dark hair braided tight, eyes sharp and unreadable behind clear safety glasses she kept wearing even indoors. Both of them greeted me politely, neither warmly. No one mentioned the rules. No one mentioned sub-level B. At 1900, Keller boarded the return helicopter. I watched from the observation slit in the stairwell as it lifted into the darkening sky. The platform shuddered under the loss of weight. For a second, the sea below flashed silver under the rotor wash. Then the aircraft dwindled into the clouds and the sound went with it, leaving only the hum of generators and the endless impact of water against the steel legs. I was alone with 3 strangers on a platform the company had reopened for reasons no one could explain, holding a folder with 2 official versions of reality in it. That was how it started. Not with a scream, not with blood. Just a polite supervisor, a sealed folder, and the quiet understanding that someone expected me to choose wrong. Some places feel isolated, and then there are places that feel unmoored. Platform Delta was the second kind. By 2200, I had learned its rough shape, but not in a way that made it feel more familiar. The surface deck wrapped around the main structure in graded walkways slick with salt spray. The operations wing sat at the center like a bunker embedded in the frame, full of old consoles and half-modern retrofits that never quite aligned with the original design. The habitation block connected to both by narrow corridors whose walls bowed inward in subtle ways you only noticed when you were already tired. Beneath all of it were the sub-levels. Storage on A, restricted access on B. The labels were stenciled in white over bulkhead doors thick enough for flooding or fire containment, depending on what story you preferred. My first shift started quietly. That was part of what made it difficult to describe afterward without sounding dramatic. Nothing happened in the cinematic sense. No lights burst. No alarms screamed. No spectral shape appeared in the corridors. What unsettled me first was the way every ordinary thing arrived slightly out of phase with expectation, and the machinery hummed a fraction too steadily, as if several independent systems had synchronized into one note. The clocks in different sections were never more than 40 seconds apart, but they were never identical either. Every window facing open water gave me the same sensation. Not that I was looking out at the ocean, but that the ocean was pressing very gently back. At 22:30, I did what any new technician does on a site, checked the logs to get a feel for the handover. The digital personnel manifests in ops, listing night staff on duty. Hal Madsen, Priya Shah, Lena Reyes. I stared at the third name for longer than I should have. "Who's Lena Reyes?" I asked. Madsen didn't look up from the monitor bank. "Why?" "She's on the personnel log." That got his attention. Not much, just enough for his shoulders to stiffen. He crossed the room, glanced at the screen, and exhaled through his nose. "System lag," he said. "Old records don't always clear right." "She's still aboard?" "No." He left it there. Priya sat on a stool near the diagnostics rack, dismantling a portable blood pressure monitor with the calm concentration of someone cleaning a weapon. She said, "If you're using the digital manifest to reassure yourself, don't. That common around here?" "Nothing's common around here." I waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. There was an extra mug in the galley when I took my first coffee break. Still warm, a pale line of lipstick dried on the rim. Priya drank tea. Madsen used a chipped black thermos with his initials burned into the lid. I stood there with my hand on the coffee pot, looking at the mug as if it might explain itself, and then told myself I was being stupid. Offshore platforms collect abandoned habits. Old stations collect them like silt. Still, I checked the sink. Dry. No one had washed up. At 2300, I made my first circuit of the lower maintenance corridor. My boots rang dully against the metal grating. Pipes ran along the walls in bundled veins painted in color codes that had faded into one another over the years. Here and there, the old placards remained bolted beside newer signage, and I noticed that the arrows didn't always agree. Emergency shelter right arrow below it, newer vinyl print, biohazard storage left arrow. Same door, same hinge marks, same rust halo around the handle. I kept walking. The thing about exhaustion is that it gives every bad feeling a convenient explanation. I had been up since dawn. I'd traveled by launch, by van, by helicopter, and I was standing in a damp steel maze after taking a contract no one else wanted. My nerves had reasons. Then I reached the camera blind near the service junction and heard someone humming. A woman low and tuneless, somewhere up ahead and around the corner. I stopped. "Hello?" The humming stopped immediately. I rounded the bend expecting to find Priya or an audio leak from a speaker. The corridor was empty. What I did find was a fresh maintenance checkmark in grease pencil on the bulkhead beside a pressure valve. Small, slanted handwriting, the sort I had seen 100 times on every industrial site I'd ever worked. LRI stood there listening to the platform breathe around me. When I got back to ops, I asked Madsen again if anyone else was on station. He was watching the external camera feed, and the water beyond the floodlights looked like torn velvet. "No," he said. "I heard someone." "So hear less." He said it without humor, eyes still on the monitor. Priya reassembled the blood pressure unit and finally met my gaze. Did you count everyone at shift start? I thought of Rule 3. Maintain visual confirmation of all personnel at shift start. The other version rose behind it. Do not trust the initial personnel count. I saw you too, I said. That wasn't what I asked. The room felt colder all at once, though the thermostat display hadn't changed. Before I could answer, one of the internal lines chirped at the comms desk. Not the phone itself, just a status pulse. Madsen crossed the room in 2 strides and muted it before a full ring sounded. He turned to me. What exactly did Keller tell you? I almost said. He told me I'd figure it out. Instead, I said not much. Good, Madsen replied. Then keep it that way. At 2340, I went to the outer observation corridor on the west side to clear my head. That was where I first understood why the rules mentioned the ocean so specifically. It had been ugly all evening, heaving under the wind in broken ridges of black and steel-gray foam. But when I stepped to the reinforced glass, I saw a surface so still it took me a second to understand what I was looking at. The water directly below the platform had gone flat, not globally. The horizon still writhed. Wind still clawed at the railing outside. Spray still hit the windows in intermittent bursts. But beneath the platform itself, in a perfect circle wider than the floodlights reached, the sea had become calm. Not restful calm. Held calm. As if a lid had been placed over something enormous. I backed away from the glass so quickly that I struck my shoulder against the opposite wall. When I looked again, the circle was gone. Waves broke normally across the surface. White water flashed and vanished. I stood there long enough for my breathing to settle, then went back to ops and said nothing. Because I already knew the problem. I didn't know which rule I had just seen. I found Lena Reyes in the maintenance corridor at 2357. Although to say I found her suggests I had been searching in the right world. I had gone back below with a flashlight and a tablet to inspect a pressure irregularity on the desalination loop. That was the official reason. The truer one was that I couldn't stand another minute in ops under Madsen's silence and Priya's watchfulness. In the platform compressed people. Even before I had proof of anything wrong, I could feel it pushing every conversation into the space just before accusation. The corridor on the B-side maintenance was narrower than the others, lined with old cable housings and redundant valves sealed with strips of tagged plastic. My light passed over damp steel, warning labels, and rivets glittering with condensation. Then it hit a pair of boots. I lifted the beam. She stood no more than 10 feet ahead of me, mid-30s maybe. Dark hair cut to the jawline, offshore coveralls with a faded pelagos patch at the chest and salt stains dried pale along the sleeves. Her face was narrow, skin sallow in the fluorescent wash, but not sickly, just worn. It was like someone who had spent too long under artificial light and come out slightly less attached to normal sleep than before. She looked at me with the strained patience of a co-worker whose name you should already know. You took your time, she said. I remember not answering right away because my mind had gone stupid with the simple fact of her existence. Real people are often most terrifying at the moment they violate the rules you've used to organize a place. You're Lena, I said finally. I used to be. There are clever things I might claim I said then if this were a story told for effect. The truth is, I blinked at her and asked, "What does that mean?" She almost smiled. It means you shouldn't start with the least useful question. Her voice was low and dry, with no detectable accent. She stepped closer. And I noticed there was moisture beading along the collar of her coveralls as if she had just come in from heavy weather, though her hair was dry. Madsen told me you weren't here, I said. Madsen says what works for his version. My version? That made her expression change. Not soften, sharpen. You really don't remember anything before arrival, do you? The question landed wrong. Too intimate, too confident. Before arrival to what? She studied me for a beat too long. You're newer than the others. Others? Instead of answering, she reached into her breast pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper. It had been written on by hand in blue block letters. She pressed it into my palm. Read that when you're alone. I unfolded it anyway. The page was damp at the corners. There were 4 rules. Rule 1. If someone answers too quickly, and they are not waiting for you. Rule 2. The ocean reflects what you brought with you. Rule 3. There are always more people than you remember. Rule 4. Choose your version early. It won't let you switch later. I looked up from the page. What is this? The only one anyone ever writes for themselves. There are already 2 official protocols. No, Lena said. There are 2 traps wearing uniforms. A tremor passed through the overhead light. Not a flicker, something more physical, like the platform had shifted a fraction of an inch on its legs. Somewhere deeper below us, metal knocked once against metal. I folded the page carefully, buying time. You said there are more people than I remember, I said. Who are they? She leaned one shoulder against the bulkhead. It depends on which side of midnight you ask from. That doesn't mean anything. It will. I should have radioed then, I know that. A stranger on a restricted platform giving me cryptic instructions and implying some shared history I did not possess. That should have triggered every sensible response left in me. But there was something in her manner that resisted panic. Not trust. I don't mean that. Trust is simple. This felt more like recognition in the wrong direction, as though some part of me had expected her before the rest caught up. You said we'd already met, I said. We had. When? In one of the versions where you listened. A burst of static crackled from the wall speaker behind me, sharp enough to make me flinch. When it cleared, I heard only the generator hum. Lena's eyes flicked to the speaker and back to me. Have they told you why Pelagos keeps Delta staffed? She asked. No. Because the thing beneath it prefers fresh decisions. A cold trickled down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I laughed again, reflexively, but it came out thin. That's not a sentence people say if they want to sound sane. Then don't worry, she replied. No one on this platform is trying to sound sane anymore. She pushed off the wall and started past me toward the ladder well. Wait, I said. What am I supposed to do with this? She stopped without turning. Choose early. Choose what? She looked back over her shoulder. You'll see which one you belong to. Then she walked away, not hurried, not furtive. Just a steady pace into the dimmer section of the corridor beyond the next junction. I followed it once. 3 long steps, then the corner, and then the empty passage beyond. No door had opened, no hatch had swung. There was nowhere on that stretch to vanish. I stood alone with the handwritten rules and the sound of my own breathing inside the hard shell of the platform. Back in my berth, I locked the door and spread all 3 rule sets out on the desk. The official documents looked more absurd beside the handwritten page, and yet the handwritten page frightened me most. It lacked bureaucracy. It didn't pretend to be a procedure. It read like notes from someone who had already understood the joke and stopped expecting rescue. My eyes kept returning to Rule 2. The ocean reflects what you brought with you. That should have meant nothing. A poetic line, maybe, from a woman trying too hard to seem mysterious. Instead, I thought of Tom Avery in the flood training compartment on Kestrel 9, one hand jammed in the narrowing gap of the hatch while the alarm screamed and seawater forced its way through the seam in white fists. I thought of the way I had looked at the pressure gauge, at the red line, at the clearance timer, and made a choice I still defended in practical language when I couldn't sleep. compartment sacrifice, containment necessity. No survivable delay. I had told the inquiry I never saw him on the far side when the door sealed. That was the lie. The sea outside struck the hull in slow, hard blows. At exactly midnight, the internal phone began to ring. There is no such thing as a neutral phone ring at midnight on an offshore platform. The sound came through the wall speaker in my berth first. One clean tone, muted but unmistakable. Then from the hallway line outside, then somewhere farther away an overlapping delay as if different sections of Delta had heard the call at different speeds. Ordinary office hardware should not have sounded predatory. This did. I stared at the desk where the two official protocols and Lena's handwritten page lay side by side. Always respond to internal calls within 30 seconds. Do not respond to internal calls after midnight. I counted without meaning to. 5, 6, 7. By 10 seconds I was already angry, which is a useful emotion when you're frightened because it lets you borrow momentum from denial. By 15 I had convinced myself that not answering would mean submitting to the game. By 20 I was at the wall phone. I lifted the receiver at 23 seconds, and for a moment I heard only static and the faint watery crackle of a bad line. Then breathing, slow, measured, very close. Hello? The breathing continued. Who is this? And then my own voice answered me, not distorted, not theatrical. My voice exactly as it sounded on recordings, flatter than I hear it from inside my skull, calm in a way I never feel while speaking. Don't trust Lena, it said. The line went dead. I stood there with the receiver in my hand until the disconnected tone began to pulse. When I finally lowered it back to the cradle, my fingers were shaking hard enough to miss the hook the first time. I turned around. The hallway beyond the open berth door looked wrong. It took me a second to identify why. The same corridor, same paint, same emergency strips along the floor, same bracketed conduits, but the proportions had altered by degrees too small for certainty. The ceiling seemed lower, the far end darker. The walls were closer together as if the platform had inhaled and not quite exhaled. I stepped out. The fluorescent light nearest my room buzzed weakly and cast a yellow tint I hadn't seen before. The air smelled damp, mineral, almost cave-like. Somewhere in the passage ahead I heard the squeal of a wheel turning without lubrication. Priya? I called. No answer. Madsen? Nothing. Then farther off, a voice I thought might have been Lena's said, "Don't run." It came from my left and right at once. I went toward Ops because it was the only direction on Delta that still felt administrative, and administration is a poor substitute for safety. Sigh, but better than none. My boots moved fast. Saint, but the corridor gave me the uneasy impression of lengthening under them. At the junction outside stores, I passed the wall mirror mounted for sightline checks and saw my reflection lag behind me by perhaps half a step. I stopped so abrupt that my shoulder hit the frame. The figure in the mirror stopped too. I told myself I had imagined it. Then the reflected version of me raised his head a fraction later than I did, as if catching up. I looked away first. Ops was occupied when I reached it, but not in the configuration I expected. Priya stood at the monitor bank staring at external feeds with white-knuckled focus. Madsen was on one knee beside an open floor panel manually resetting a breaker. Both looked up when I entered, and the expression on Priya's face, relief mixed with suspicion, told me something had already happened to them too. "The phones are active," I said. Madsen gave a harsh laugh with no humor in it. "You answered?" I didn't reply. Priya saw the answer in my face. What did it say? It sounded like me. That sentence hung in the room longer than it should have. Madsen stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag already black with grease. Did it give instructions? It told me not to trust Lena. Priya and Madsen exchanged a glance so quick it barely registered, but I caught it. "You know who she is," I said. "Everyone here knows who she is," Priya answered. "Then tell me." Instead, she pointed at the personnel cameras. I went to the monitor wall. There were 6 split screens showing critical corridors, stairwells, the galley, and the west observation passage. On the galley feed, the extra mug still sat on the counter. On the lower maintenance corridor feed, a woman stood in profile beneath a flickering light. Lena. On the stairwell camera, I saw myself standing in the stairwell outside ops. I turned around. The room behind me was empty except for Priya and Madsen. When I looked back, the camera image of me in the stairwell lifted one hand and touched the wall where no wall phone existed. The feed jumped to static. "No," Madsen said sharply, though whether to the monitor or me I couldn't tell. Priya muttered, "We're drifting early." "Drifting where?" I snapped. She ignored the question. "What time did the line ring?" "Midnight exactly." "That's too soon." "Too soon for what?" Madsen crossed to a drawer, unlocked it, and removed a grease pencil. He pressed it into my hand. "If you go anywhere alone, mark the walls at shoulder height," he said. "If the mark moves, don't follow the corridor." "That isn't in any of the rules." "No," he replied. "That's because the rules are for sorting, not surviving." Before I could force him to explain, the external motion alarm chirped once from the west deck camera. Priya hit the feed. The ocean outside the floodlights had gone still again. This time not in a circle. This time everywhere the camera could see. A perfect black plain stretched to the horizon. No wind texture, no white water, no visible swell. It looked less like a calm sea than polished stone laid under the world. Something pale moved just beneath the surface, a shape too large to name. The image distorted with static before any of us could agree we had seen it. Madsen reached for the lockdown switch, then froze. On the opposite monitor wall, the internal stairwell feed lit up. 3 figures were climbing toward ops. One was me. One was Lena. The third wore Priya's face and smiled too wide to be tired. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Priya whispered very carefully, "Don't trust whoever arrives second." The door handle began to turn. Memory gets unreliable when fear becomes continuous. That isn't me excusing omissions. It's the only honest way to explain the next hour. I remember Madsen killing the lights in ops except for the monitors. I remember Priya locking the main door, then unlocking it again 10 seconds later because she said if we acted as though we were hiding, they would act as though they were hunting. I remember the footsteps in the corridor stopping outside the room and remaining there long enough to feel deliberate. No one knocked. No one spoke. Eventually, the handle stopped moving, and when Madsen checked the corridor through the wired glass panel, it was empty. After that, we separated, though I can no longer say whether that was strategy or drift. Priya wanted to verify the med stores and check the west observation seal. Madsen said he needed to inspect the lower relays before the maps changed again. I asked what maps he meant, and he said, "The kind you walk on." Then he looked at me in a way that implied he was tired of my beginner questions. He wasn't wrong. I took the grease pencil and made for the lower levels. By then, the platform had stopped pretending to be stable. It was still recognizably Delta, but only in the same way a badly remembered dream can still be recognized as your childhood home. Corridor lengths shifted. Signage contradicted itself more aggressively. The pressure door to A-level stores opened into a locker bay the first time I checked it and into an old sample prep room the second. A narrow service passage I had used an hour earlier dead-ended at a bulkhead marked Wet Lab Access, even though Delta had no active wet lab in the schematics I'd been shown. I marked the wall at every junction. 3 times I looked back and found my own mark 6 inches higher than where I had placed them. Once, I found two marks on the same wall in slightly different shades of yellow, one of which was unmistakably my handwriting and one of which bent the last stroke the wrong way. At 0:41, and the intercom crackled overhead, and in my own voice said, "Jonah, don't go below 1." That was when I began to understand that whatever was happening did not merely imitate, it iterated. I stopped near the west observation corridor because the windows there faced the open sea, and in a place where walls could no longer be trusted, I wanted at least one reference point outside the structure. The water was rough again, but wrong in a new fashion. Different sections of the surface moved under different weather conditions. 10 yards of violent chop gave way to smooth, dark lanes that threaded beneath the platform legs like roads. White spray struck the glass, yet the reflections on the inside surface slid down a moment before the droplets landed. I thought of Lena's handwritten rule. The ocean reflects what you brought with you. And at the far end of the corridor, where the reinforcement ribs split the window panels, I saw a reflection of a man in orange immersion coveralls standing behind me. Tom Avery never wore orange immersion coveralls on Kestrel 9. He had been in blue training gear. I knew that. I knew it with the hard precision of guilt. But when I turned, I expected him anyway. The corridor was empty. When I looked back at the glass, the reflected man was gone, but the handprint remained. 5 wet marks spread on the inside of the pane, fingers splayed as if pressed there by someone leaning close. I walked away fast after that and found myself, by no route I would swear to, in a lower service spine I had not seen on the schematics. The air grew heavier, not warmer, heavier. Breathing felt laborious, like drawing through wet cloth. Condensation silvered the pipes overhead. Somewhere ahead, water dripped at regular intervals with a resonance too deep for surface runoff. The signs along the wall changed. Sublevel B, authorized personnel only 10 feet later. Archive isolation. Then pressure containment/no entry. Then painted by hand directly over the last sign in flaking white. Safe below 1 o'clock. The bulkhead door at the end stood open. That frightened me more than if it had been sealed. Open doors imply invitation or surrender. Inside was a short antechamber lined with dead monitors and old instrument racks. Several screens still glowed on emergency current. Their feeds showed different sections of Delta, but not the Delta I had just walked through. On one, Madsen argued with a man I had never seen. On another, Priya sat alone in the galley with her head in her hands. On a third, I watched myself standing in my berth reading the 2 rule sheets for the first time, except I remembered that I had been sitting down. A timestamp in the corner read 3:12. Tomorrow, if tomorrow still meant anything. Beside the screens hung a corkboard pinned with incident notes, maintenance tags, personnel Polaroids, and laminated protocols in various stages of revision. Some were official Pelagos forms. Others were handwritten additions. Several had been torn in half. One photograph showed 4 staff members in front of the helipad. Keller, Madsen, Priya, Lena. On the back in black marker, someone had written, "Do not let the new one stay undecided." My hand had started shaking again. I don't know if it was fear or recognition, and sometimes they feel identical at the wrist. I went deeper. The chamber beyond the antechamber was colder to the skin but wet in the lungs. Frost feathered the edges of the inner door, or though nothing there felt frozen. A low, rhythmic exhale seemed to move through the walls themselves, expanding and contracting the damp air. That was where the floor changed from grated steel to poured composite. That was where I realized the whole sublevel had not been built as part of the original platform. It had been inserted around something. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting Madsen or one of the false copies from the cameras. It was Lena, or Alina. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, watching me the way you watch a patient finally find the edge of the wound. "You followed the overlaps," she said. "Yeah, I think they followed me." That too. I looked past her into the antechamber screens. On one of them, another version of Lena stood where she was standing now, except that one had blood dried across one cheek and a torn sleeve exposing gray-blue bruising down the forearm. "How many of you are there?" I asked. She took a while to answer. "Enough to know you shouldn't have answered the phone." Then she stepped aside, revealing the room beyond, and I saw the others. There are images that shock you because they are grotesque, and images that shock you because they abolish the stable relationship between your mind and the world. What I saw in the inner chamber of sub-level B belonged to the second kind. The room was larger than the dimensions beneath Delta should have allowed. That was my first thought, absurdly technical, in some corner of my training still trying to solve horror with geometry. The chamber widened beneath the platform like a buried dome, its ceiling lost behind layers of pipe, cabling, and transparent conduits filmed with condensation. Light came from recessed strips sunk into the floor, colorless and low, leaving faces lit from below and shadows rising behind them like stains. They stood in loose arcs around the room. People I recognized, people I had never met, multiple versions of both. Hal Madsen appeared 3 times within my first sweep of the chamber. One had his beard longer and threaded with more gray. One wore a harness clipped wrong and kept murmuring to himself without sound. One stood with his eyes fixed on the far wall, lips moving in a rhythm too slow to be prayer. I saw Priya twice. In one version sat on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at her own hands as if waiting for them to finish changing. Another stood rigidly straight beside a frost-rimmed support column, a line of blood crusted from one nostril to her upper lip. And then I saw myself, not in mirrors, not on screens, not in the peripheral stutter of glass reflections, standing 10 feet away in a body with my face. There were at least 4 of me. One older, hair receding more sharply at the temples, left hand bandaged to the wrist. One with a split lip and bruising along the jaw. One whose coveralls were soaked dark to mid-thigh, seawater dripping soundlessly to the floor. And one, God help me, the one from the cold open in my mind long before it happened, the smiling version, dry, composed, watching me with terrible calm. In all of them were slightly different in posture and breath in the set of the shoulders. None looked surprised to see me. I must have made some sound because Lena touched my elbow lightly. "Don't let them hear panic as hunger," she said. I almost jerked away from her hand. "What is this?" "This," she answered, "is where the platform decides." The breathing in the walls deepened, as though in response to the sentence. I looked around the chamber again. Some of the figures were absolutely still. Others made tiny repetitive motions. A thumb rubbing a knuckle, a jaw tightening and relaxing, a blink that came half a second too late. At the center of the room, set into the floor, was a circular panel of reinforced glass clouded from beneath. Something moved under it with the slow certainty of a tide. "Decides what?" I asked. Which version of you gets to exist?" The room tilted, not physically, not enough to fall. But my body lost its easy contract with balance. I put a hand against the nearest support column and found it wet with a condensation that smelled faintly organic, like skin kept too long under bandages. "That isn't possible," I said. Lena gave me a look I had already begun to hate, the look of someone too tired for another denial. "No," she said, "but it's happening." The older version of Madsen turned his head toward us and said, in a hoarse voice, "Don't stand near the center." No one else reacted to him. I stared at Lena. "What are they?" "Outcomes. People. Both." The split-lip version of me took one slow step forward. "Don't listen to her," he said. His voice was mine and not mine, roughened, exhausted. She survives by keeping things unresolved. The smiling version of me said very gently, "That's one way to describe anyone." I backed up hard enough to hit the column again. Lena moved with me. "They'll start talking now that you're here." "What do they want?" Her answer was immediate. "To be the one." Beneath the floor, something vast shifted. Frost blossomed and vanished across the edge of the glass panel, not from cold, but from sudden pressure changes in the humid air. It really did feel like standing inside someone else's breath. I forced myself to ask the question that had already lodged in me like metal. What happens to the rest? Lena didn't hesitate. Food. Silence followed that word, but it was not empty, it was full of swallowing. The version of Priya on the floor began to laugh under her breath. Not because anything was funny, because laughter is adjacent to suffocation. I stepped away from Lena then, because if what she said was true, proximity had become a kind of vote. "Why are there different rules?" I asked. "To shape the branches," she said. "Branches? Choices, timing, attention, fear. Who do you answer? Which room do you trust? Whether you count the right people or the wrong ones, or count it all. Small choices create divergence. Enough divergence gives it options." "It," now the smiling version of me answered. "The thing beneath the platform," he said. "What else?" I looked toward the clouded floor panel. Something pale drifted below the glass and vanished into murk. The shape suggested neither flesh nor machinery, and yet implied both. "This was a research site," I said, grasping at whatever order still seemed plausible. "What were they studying?" Madsen with Gray laughed once, a dry bark. "Containment," he said, "until containment became cultivation." Lena's eyes remained on me. "Pelagos found something under Delta years ago. It responded to observation, then to language, then to the decision. By the time they understood it was producing parallel resolution states, they'd already built half the platform around it." "Parallel versions," she snapped. "Use whatever word lets you understand it before it understands you better." That landed harder than the rest because it fit what I had already felt since arrival. Not haunting, not infestation, but calibration. The wet version of me looked up from the floor and whispered, "It likes the guilty ones." I knew, even before he raised his head fully, that he would have Tom Avery's expression in his eyes. He didn't. He had mine. That was worse. Lena followed my gaze. "Yes," she said quietly. "It reflects what you brought with you." The smiling version of me spread his hands a little, almost welcoming. "It made you have more options than usual," he said. Then footsteps sounded in the antechamber. Several heads turned at once. Someone was coming below. And for the first time, some of the versions around the room looked afraid. Madsen entered first, or a Madsen did. He came through the inner door with a flare gun in one hand and a flashlight in the other, sweeping the beam across the chamber until it landed on me. Priya followed close behind, carrying a metal emergency case and breathing too fast. They both looked real in the insufficient way everything on Delta had begun to look real, inconvincing until compared against a second copy. The problem was that there was already one. Near the far wall, the blood-nosed Priya lifted her head. Near the support column, the murmuring Madsen went suddenly quiet. The two new arrivals saw their counterparts and did not react with surprise. Only exhaustion. That was somehow worse than panic. "Did he come down on his own?" Priya asked Lena. "Yes." "Then he's still open," Madsen said. "Still undecided," Lena corrected. The smiling version of me chuckled softly. "You say that as if there's a meaningful difference." Madsen raised the flare gun toward him without warning. "Don't," Lena said sharply. Too late. He fired. The flare crossed the chamber in a red howl and struck not the smiling version, but the air 3 feet in front of him. For an instant, something transparent and wet seemed to flex there like skin disturbed under shallow water. The flare dropped, hissing, and rolled across the floor until it guttered against the central glass panel. Red light washed over every face in the room, turning us all into emergency versions of ourselves. Beneath the glass, something answered. The entire floor gave a slow, convulsive pulse. Several of the standing figures staggered. The Priya on the floor began choking. Frost feathered up the support columns and vanished again. "Idiot!" Lena hissed. Mattson didn't lower the flare gun. "You want him left open? That's how we got the last cascade." "There was no last cascade in your sequence," the older Mattson from the wall said. My head snapped toward him. "What does that mean?" Priya put the emergency case down and faced me fully, and there were tears standing in her eyes. She seemed too busy to wipe them away. "It means the rules were never instructions," she said. "They were sorters." I thought of the 2 printed pages, the tiny wording differences, and Keller's smile. "Pelagos made them? Pelagos curated them," Priya said. "The thing below made the need." Lena stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "Delta doesn't just contain the anomaly. It stabilizes the point where it breaches. Human decision-making gives it structure. Contradictory instructions create divergent outcomes. Divergent outcomes create versions. It prunes, feeds, and learns." My skin crawled under the coveralls. "Learns what?" This time Mattson answered. "Which version of a person is most usable?" No one spoke for a moment after that. The word echoed through me more deeply than food had. A food is passive. Usable implies intention. I looked around the chamber again at the copies of us arranged like test results. "Usable for what?" The smiling version of me met my gaze. "To go back upstairs," he said. Something inside me dropped cold and final into place. Not all the versions were leftovers waiting to be consumed. Some were prototypes. That realization changed the room. Every face became a negotiation. Every tiny difference in posture carried a motive. The smiling me did not appear less afraid because he was braver. He appeared less afraid because fear no longer served his outcome. "I don't understand why me," I said. The wet version of me laughed weakly. "You do." I didn't want to hear it from him. I didn't want any version of me to say it aloud because once spoken, guilt becomes infrastructure. Priya did it anyway. Keller screened for prior incident exposure, she said. Trauma, moral injury, split decision history. People who had already lived through moments where one choice survived and another should have. I stared at her. "You recruited me because of Kestrel 9. Her silence was answer enough. Mattson looked away. The chamber seemed to inhale around us. I thought of the contract terms, the speed of the approval, the way Keller had watched me read the folder like a man setting bait exactly where a fish had already bitten once. "You knew," I said. "We knew enough to stay staffed," Priya replied, and there was such bitterness in it that I understood she had not been allowed innocence either. Lena said, "That's why the ocean feels personal here. It uses fault lines. Guilt gives it depth." The smiling version of me took another slow step forward. "I can help you," he said. "Don't," Lena snapped. He ignored her. "You think survival means remaining the one who arrived. It doesn't. Arrival is just the least informed version." "Shut up," I said, though my voice lacked force. He smiled wider, not monstrous, not exaggerated, just relieved, almost kind. "You sealed the hatch on Tom Avery yourself," he said. Mattson and Priya both looked at me. "He saw you," the smiling version continued. "That's the part you never put in the report. He looked straight at you when the wheel turned. Stop. You chose already, Jonah. Years ago. Delta only gives people like you a cleaner language for it. I lunged at him then, not out of courage, but because rage is sometimes the last form of self-defense available. I never reached him. The floor between us rippled, not physically exactly, but in the way space can become harder than certainty. Lena caught my arm. Priya shouted something. Somewhere behind me, another phone began ringing upstairs, tinny through the ductwork. The versions reacted instantly. Some flinched toward the sound. Some recoiled. Some listened with ecstatic stillness. Lena's grip tightened painfully. "This is the last branch point," she said. "You answer one way or another now." "What if I don't choose?" All three of them, Lena, Priya, Madsen, answered together. "You already are." The central glass panel clouded black from below. All around the chamber, the versions of us started moving. Slowly at first, out of sync. A step here, a turn there, each following a slightly different logic that still converged on me. The wet me reached out with trembling fingers, and the split-lip me backed away as if from a cliff edge. The smiling me opened his arms almost intimately, as though inviting an embrace between brothers who had settled an old argument. The walls pulsed. Above us I could hear the sea, or what sounded like the sea, go completely still. Lena's voice came from very near my ear. "You still haven't chosen," she said. "It is possible to understand something perfectly and still make the wrong decision. In fact, understanding can refine the error." When the platform shifted, every bolted certainty I still possessed came loose at once. The chamber lights dimmed to a colorless dusk. The breathing in the walls deepened until it was indistinguishable from pressure changes inside my own chest. Condensation streamed down the support columns in sudden sheets, coating the floor with a slick sheen that smelled like low tide in a sealed room. The ocean outside had gone calm. I couldn't see it from the chamber directly, but I knew. Everyone in the room knew. The silence above us changed shape. No wave impact, no wind rattle. Only a held stillness so complete it felt placed. If the ocean is calm, it is already inside. Which rule had that been? Official or warning? By then, it no longer mattered. There are moments when contradiction resolves only because both sides become true. The versions began circling. Not quickly. That would have been easier to resist. Predatory slowness gives the mind too much time to attach meaning. The older me moved left, favoring his bandaged hand. The split-lip me kept glancing at the inner door like escape still existed as a category. The wet me cried quietly without making a sound. Priya's copies mirrored each other at opposite ends of the chamber, one trying to approach, one visibly forcing herself not to. Madsen's version stood like failed sentries, each apparently convinced that the correct response still existed, if only he could remember which protocol he had trusted last. Lena alone stayed fixed beside me, or seemed to. "Tell me what happens if I pick wrong," I said. She didn't answer. "Lena." Her face turned toward me in profile. There was grief there, or I thought there was. On Delta, even emotion felt doubled. "You won't know it was wrong from the inside," she said. That terrified me more than death would have. The internal phone rang again above us, one sharp metallic note, then another, then the sound spread through the structure in staggered repetition, every office handset and wall line joining the chorus at slightly different intervals until the entire platform seemed threaded with ringing. The copies reacted more visibly now. The smiling me lifted his head as though hearing music. The wet me covered his ears. One of the Madsens sank to his knees. The floor panel at the center of the room went clear for a second. I wish it had stayed cloudy. Something vast moved beneath the glass, pale and articulate in ways no natural body should be. Not tentacles, not limbs. It rearranged itself too fluidly for anatomy. A field of almost human forms seemed to surface and fold back into one another. Faces suggested and erased before they could resolve, mouths opening along the lines where separate possibilities touched. It was not a creature that had swallowed people. It was a process made visible through hunger. And it was looking up. The smiling me spoke over the ringing phones. "You can stop being torn," he said, "by becoming you, by becoming the version that can live with what's already true." I hated him because he sounded reasonable. I hated him because part of me recognized the argument. On Kestrel 9, after Tom died, I had survived by choosing a version of myself who could narrate the event in acceptable terms. Compartment pressure, protocol adherence, no actionable negligence. That version of me had signed forms, shaken hands, and kept breathing. Another version had remained with a dead man at a steel hatch forever. Delta was not inventing division in me. It had found existing seam lines and driven them open with precision. The smiling me took another step. Lena moved in front of me. Don't." He looked at her with mild contempt. "You only keep him branching because you can't hold form without undecided minds." Something flashed across her face then. Anger. Yes, but also exposure. A truth I had not understood until that moment. "You're one of the discarded ones," I said. She didn't deny it. "I'm one of the ones that learned," she replied. The phones kept ringing. Priya shouted from somewhere to my right. "Jonah, if you merge by fear, it keeps the interface," Madsen yelled over her. "If he doesn't choose, it takes all of us." The chamber lurched. Not sideways, deeper. For a second, gravity felt misapplied. The wet me fell to all fours. The split lip me slammed into a support column and left blood on the frost. The smiling me remained upright without effort. Stable. That was the word that arrived then. Not kind. Not human. Not safe. Stable. I thought of every practical decision I had ever made in the shadow of something irreversible. I thought of reports written in passive voice. I thought of calling survival by cleaner names than it deserved. I thought of how tired I was of being split between what I had done and what I had told myself about it. The smiling man held out his hand. No panic, no begging, just certainty. And in that room, certainty felt like oxygen. I ran toward him. Lena screamed my name. The split lip me lunged as if to intercept me, but he slipped on the wet floor and crashed shoulder first into the glass panel. Cracks spidered across the surface, thin and instantly black from beneath. Several other versions recoiled. The smiling me did not move until the last second. Then he stepped forward, and I stepped back. Or maybe both happened. And that is the moment language fails. There was no collision. No impact in the ordinary sense. It felt instead like walking into the outline of myself drawn in freezing water. My skin went cold all at once, but not externally. Cold flooded inward through the eyes, the ears, the back of the teeth, every muscle locked. My vision whitened, then sharpened to impossible detail. I saw individual droplets hanging in the air between us. I saw Lena's pupils contract. I saw the fractures beneath the central glass widen in neat branching geometry. And then memory doubled. I remembered lunging. I remembered waiting. I remembered standing in the chamber for hours already, calm, while another version of me arrived frantic and late. I remembered not being afraid because fear belonged to the one approaching. When sensation returned fully, and I was standing upright. The ringing had stopped. The room was quiet except for the deep, satisfied exhale from beneath the floor. Several of the other versions were gone, not fallen, not fled. Gone in the way a wrong answer disappears when the page is taken away. Lena stood several feet from me, pale and breathing hard, looking at my face the way one looks at a door that is just locked from the wrong side. "Jonah," she said. I smiled at her. The expression came easily. Too easily. And that, more than anything else, should have told me I had survived incorrectly. I'm still on platform Delta, at least I think I am. The sentence looks absurd when I write it down, but no more absurd than anything else that happened below 1 a.m. that night. I have learned to value exactness even when exactness no longer guarantees truth. Here there was no dramatic morning after, no rescue vessel breaking the horizon, no emergency beacon, no corporate extraction team, no debrief in a bright room where someone sensible told me the entire event had been exposure, pressure, fatigue. Dawn came the way it always does offshore, without kindness, just a thinning of black into steel gray beyond wet glass. Systems hummed. The galley coffee maker clicked on automatically at 5:30. Somewhere a pump cycled. The platform resumed its routine with the terrible competence of something that had never been in danger. Everything worked. That was the first wrongness. Not perfectly, Delta was too old for perfection, but coherently. The corridor lengths no longer seemed to shift. The signs no longer contradicted themselves. Doors led where I expected. The clocks matched within a second. Even when I checked the personnel register in Ops, it listed 3 names on active night rotation. Hal Madsen, Priya Shah, Jonah Mercer, no Lena Reyes. I asked Madsen about her anyway. He frowned in the superficial way people do when indulging a question attached to a dream. There's never been a Lena on current staffing, he said. Current staffing, a careful phrase. Priya heard him and said nothing. She has become quieter since that night. Or perhaps this is simply the quieter version of her. She still watches me, though less like a witness than a physician monitoring a symptom she cannot treat. Sometimes I catch her studying my reflection instead of my face. The folder Keller gave me is still in my possession. There are no longer 2 sets of rules inside, there is one. Typed, official, clean. Rule 1. Do not respond to internal calls after midnight. Rule 2. If the ocean is calm, initiate no unnecessary movement. Rule 3. Personnel count may fluctuate until dawn. Remain with the version of events that is stable. Rule 4. Sublevel B is restricted unless directed by operations. That wording is new. I know it is new the same way I know certain scars by touch alone. But the paper is old. The staple holes line up. The signature block carries Keller's name exactly where it always did. When I think too hard about that, I develop pressure behind my eyes that lasts for hours. The ocean is calm every night now. Not calm in the meteorological sense. The weather reports still show swells and surface winds. Spray still salts the windows, but sometimes after midnight, even if I stand at the west observation corridor and look down through the reflected lights, I can see the black plane gathering under the platform like a held breath. It no longer frightens me the way it did. That may be the worst part. I don't feel afraid anymore. I can remember fear. I can describe it in adequate technical detail. I know what my pulse used to do when the phone rang, when a reflection moved incorrectly, when a corridor seemed narrower than I remembered. But the emotional reality of fear has receded from me like a coastline swallowed by fog. In its place is a steadier thing. Purpose, perhaps. Function. Usability. I hate that I thought the word without resistance. Sometimes there are still discrepancies. A mug in the galley that no one claims. A 4th shadow on a stairwell camera that vanishes when I zoom. A patch of damp footprints outside my berth, though I have been inside for an hour. On those occasions, as I do what now feels obvious, I do not investigate too quickly. I do not answer every anomaly as if it deserves equal status. I let weaker versions collapse on their own. That is how I know I changed. The internal phones still ring after midnight. Not every night, just enough. I let them ring. At first that was because of the rule. Now it is because I already know what waits on the line. Twice, early on, I almost answered from habit. Both times I stopped with my hand inches from the receiver because I knew with the intimate certainty of self-recognition, that the voice on the other end would be mine. Panicked, breathless, still divided, it would tell me I chose wrong. It would beg me to go back below, to listen to Lena, to the break sequence before the next arrival. But that doesn't make sense, because I survived, didn't I? Some nights I think about Tom Avery and try to summon the rawness of what I once felt at the memory of his hand in the hatch. I can still access the facts, the compartment number, the seal cycle time, the official findings. I can even remember the exact way his eyes found mine through the narrowing gap. What I can't recover is the part that kept me split open. It's as if that version of remorse became nutriment for something better adapted to continue. I've considered writing all of this as a report for Pelagos, but reports are for superiors, and I no longer believe anyone above Delta is more ignorant than I am. Keller hasn't returned, though a supply transfer is scheduled in 3 days. I know he'll smile if I see him, and I know he'll look at my face for confirmation before he looks at any system diagnostics. I know he'll hand the next contractor a folder. Maybe 2 folders, maybe only 1, depending on what this version of the platform now needs. I have started noticing something else in reflective surfaces, not always, just enough. In the dark windows of the west corridor, in the brushed steel of the galley kettle, in the black gloss of powered-down monitor screens, my reflection no longer hesitates. It moves first. A hand to the face before I have decided to touch it. A turn of the head before my neck obeys. A smile arrives before I feel any reason for one. Then I follow because resisting would only reopen questions I am no longer built to survive. The phone is ringing now as I write this. It started on the wall line by the berth and spread outward. It one station after another until the sound threaded through the whole platform in staggered metallic pulses. Madsen is pretending not to hear it. Priya has closed the medbay door. Outside the porthole, the sea has gone smooth as poured glass. I know what the voice will say if I answer. I know it will sound like me. I know it will be afraid. And I know that when the next helicopter comes, when the next man steps onto Delta with salt still fresh on his boots and a need heavy enough to keep him here, I will meet him at the landing pad with a folder in my hand. He will ask which rules are correct. I already know how I'll smile. "You'll figure it out," I'll say.